All right, here comes another old school Jay video where it's just me and the camera. Finishing up my personal rig. Remember I had the sensor panel problem where the panel I got was, well, not the panel I got, but the panel I already had was too big to fit where I wanted it. I want to kind of address some comments and questions I had about why I didn't do certain things. I guess I didn't show it very clearly. So I'm gonna take you guys along for the ride on that, show you the new panel that we got, get it installed. And then kind of show you a little change I made to the system that I'm not sure if it's going to be necessarily like beneficial, but I did it anyway. Enhance your professional monitor setup with the Viewsonic VP27885K, featuring 100% sRGB, 99% DCI P3 colors, and HDR 400 for deep contrast that align perfectly with Mac's industry-leading color performance. The VP27885K supports laptops, PCs, Macs, and more with Thunderbolt 4, USB-C, HDMI DisplayPort, and USB inputs. If you're looking to increase your screen real estate for projects, click the link in the description for more. Okay, so talk about sensor panels. First of all, I had these really crazy long cables on them because in Skunkworks I couldn't find a place to make it mount nicely. Now, actually, let me back up. Many of you might be like, what the hell is a sensor panel? So it's a trend that's actually been happening for about the last 5 years now, where people are putting monitors or some sort of device inside their system that does nothing but show temperatures, maybe voltages. In this instance, I'm gonna be able to monitor the amps when it comes to the 12-volt high power pins. So it just becomes like a quick at-a-glance dashboard for the things that are happening in your system when it comes to telemetry. Realistically, think of it as no different than the gauges on your car. It's just, its only purpose is to really do that. So back in the earlier days, people were doing it with like cell phones and such, like old Android devices hooked up via USB to the computer and then using a different app to kind of turn it into a monitor. And then Raspberry Pi screens became really popular, like the 3-inch screens and the 5-inch screens and the 7-inch screens, and now these like super wide or ultra wide screens have become extremely popular. So that's why they have these nice enclosures and such on them, screws to actually mount a Raspberry Pi onto the back, which is kind of neat, but obviously we're not using it for Raspberry Pis. Now the cables that are on this one are really long because of the fact that in Skunkworks I couldn't find a place to really kind of neatly mount it where it made sense. So I actually mounted it underneath my monitor and then had to run long cables all the way to the system as if it were like a keyboard or a mouse, right? In fact, a lot of panels now are even coming with like kickstands or a really like a neat 45-degree angle or a flexible stand so you can put it on your keyboard, which makes a lot more sense if you're gonna use it as a dashboard to have it more in front of you without having to like turn your head and look at the system. My personal preference is I just like it all contained within the system. It's kind of neat to look over there and see, oh, there's a display in your system, which is kind of cool. Now the mini HDMI cable, because these are almost always mini HDMI and micro USB when it comes to connections. Now my mini HDMI cable is, I don't know if it'll focus on that with my head in the way. Will it focus? Not really. Anyway, it's a really thick cable. Now, one of the things I showed is where I wanted to put it in my system. You can actually see a couple of the changes right there. I actually added 2 fans behind the reservoir. There's a pretty big gap between those fans and the res. They're probably not doing much. Some of the air does come through right here, and it does come through these gaps right here with the giant, as you can see, the big cutouts for EATX boards and such. It does provide some additional positive pressure to the case, but to be honest, it's just more of an aesthetically cool looking thing at this point to have more of those fans light up through the back of the reservoir. But it's not gonna matter because my panel's going right there. But anyway, this is the original one, and I showed one I had to use. I have these double 90s right here bringing this reservoir or this tube up to get it into the same height I need for my drain system over there. And we'll talk about this drain in a second. A lot of people were like, really? You're just gonna drain it into your rig? Anyway, I also, because I measured wrong over here and I was off slightly, I had to put this kind of an angled rotary, or it's an offset rotary, in here to make it line up, which this, believe it or not, took up the space I needed, because I did take into account for my screen, but I didn't take into account the cables. So either way, if I mounted the cables upright, they would then cover my drain port up in there, as you can kind of see. If I mounted them downward, then they just directly interfered with hitting my port, my drain port, and my 90-degree adapters right there. Now let's talk about the drain here real quick. Check this out. This drain is threaded on the end. So what you do is you take the cap off like I just showed you, you thread on a barb fitting with a tube, they just run the tubing to the outside, and then when you pull the valve open, then it drains. I mean, I guess those comments show me and tell me those are the people that have never really water cooled before, which is fine. This is about learning, but it's just, I can't possibly explain every little thing every time I do a build, because some stuff like this is going to get missed and forgotten, because to me it seems like such common sense, but if you've never done a custom loop like that, you wouldn't think about the fact that the drains do have threads on both ends and you run a tube. This guy, same thing. I'm not going to just let it piss out this fitting right here. I'm going to put a tube on there and into a bucket. Anyway, moving on. This is the screen that I had. This is an 8.8 inch screen right here. This is the 7.8 inch screen that I measured. And I love how so many of the comments were like, Jay, asking for 1 less inch is not a sentence I think any man would ever ask for. But anyway, as you can see, this one's actually slightly wider than this one, which is actually making me happy, because I'm gonna mount it on the reservoir right there, which means it's gonna fill it out a little better. But you can see with the diagonal difference right there, I got the height back that I need. Let's talk about angled and 90-degree adapters real quick. As you can see by looking at both of these, the cables come off the bottom. The HDMI is always like more in the middle, and the USB is always off to the side. If I did a 90-degree HDMI, and I've already looked at these cables by the way, it points it right at the USB. So I wouldn't be able to plug in a USB because the HDMI 90-degree adapter points it right at the USB. If I point it the other way, the 90-degree USB hits the HDMI. So I can't do double 90s, which means I still have one hanging down, which leads to the same problem I had at the start. We can talk about ribbon cables real quick. I looked for ribbon cables for USB, and I'll be honest, I didn't look very long, but I looked for ribbon cables for the USB, and they all seem to be USB 2.0. Now it's probably fine for this because there's no data happening through USB, it's just getting power through USB. But now that I know that the screen that I'm going with has thinner cables, which allow me to be a little more flexible with them, and is a little wider, I'm happy I changed the screen anyway. Now I want to test the screen and make sure it works, obviously, but there's a button on the back right here. I'm not quite sure what that button does, but I'm not gonna have access to it anymore unless I were to like 3D print some standoffs to make it farther from the res, that way I could reach behind it. That's why I need to see what the function is first. If the function isn't anything important, if it's just like brightness and contrast and all that stuff, I can just set it. And then as long as it remembers those settings when it loses power, then I can just forget it. I won't have to worry about accessing that again. I might try and see if I can find something that can work as a little bit of a standoff. I might just have Nick, when he comes in, just print me 2 thin blocks of plastic that I can, tape on the bottom, tape on the top, and then, like I said, I have a little gap so I can still at least get to it. It'd have to be at least as thick as my finger. Actually, I guess it just had to be fingertip on the, no, it still have to be as thick as my finger. Insert all your dirty jokes here, I know you're going to. All right, so let's turn the system on. Let's turn the screen on. It is an IPS screen, so it shouldn't look terrible. A lot of the earlier screens too were TFT, which is, they're terrible. Color recreation was awful on those. The off viewing access was bad. It was always like tinfoil-y and gross looking. So fortunately, this is a IPS screen. So let's see how it looks. One thing I'm also a huge fan about with this Aorus Master X870E board is it actually has an HDMI right there on the motherboard, and it lines up perfectly with this hole, so I can get the cable back behind there and then run it around to where I need it. But this is awesome. It means I won't have to be running it to the outside of the case. I will have to be running to the outside of the case on my USB, because all of my internal USB, they're all too short, the ones that I have. They won't reach from there to the internal. So I do have to run this outside the case. Fortunately, there is this hole right here that would actually allow me to run it to the backside. So there we go. Oh, and the brand, by the way, wow, I'm terrible at this, aren't I? It's from Amazon. It's like Weiss Cocoa. Weiss Cocoa. You know how the Amazon names are. They're really stupid. And I know I could just look at the manual to see what the button does, but I'm still gonna test it this way. So here we go. Let's boot it up. Now the thing a lot about these screens is, since they're HDMI and my main monitor is DisplayPort, there's a very good chance the splash screen will actually end up on here, which would suck because that would also mean that the BIOS would end up on there. Oh, no, we're good. It went to DisplayPort first. So we need to get into Windows, let it sort of activate multiple monitor mode. Kind of curious as to why right now I'm not getting any sort of, oh, I know why. Okay, duh. The internal is actually using, there we go. This is the coolest part about the motherboard, having the HDMI on the board and not going through the graphics card. This is actually running off of the internal iGPU on the 9950X 3D. So it's not going to be the resolution of this and the slight load that this is going to have by being pixels that have to render an image are not going to affect the GPU at all because they're happening off the iGPU. And since you can't really turn off the 9950X 3D iGPU as far as I have seen, yes, plug in all your shit. This is going to always be just the only thing that's showing on there. So let's go to Windows here real quick. Let's see what's gonna happen with our displays. There it is right there, number 2, see? So even though we have 2 different GPUs running this, I can, where is it? There it is. I can still set up the arrangement how I want. So I would just put it like way off to the side to the right. If my system is on the right, I would leave it on the right. That way if I needed to mouse over to it for some reason, so if you watch my mouse, I should go off to the right of the screen. And technically, this is like this. So what I need to do now, see it's all backwards. There we go. So there we go, there it is. Well, actually before I do that, I need to see what this button does, right? Oh, it's just a one-touch brightness. Sick. Okay, it's like a 17 touch brightness. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so it's 10 touch. 10, 10. All right, so there we go. I got the screen installed. It's just double-sided tape, quite literally. And then if I show you where the plugs are, the spacing on this one actually was perfect where I can straddle this bottom plug. So the HDMI is going between the drain and the bottom port, and then the USB is between there, and it's all going down into the bottom and then up and routed around. So you can see I've got my HDMI coming out right there into the motherboard, and then on the back side, coming out of that hole like I showed you down there, is the USB going right into the very first USB 3 plug, and then we're good. And then you can see, like I said, with those fans back there, just a little bit more dynamic light kind of coming through. Like I said, it's not much, but there is for sure airflow coming through these holes. So that's just adding more cool volume of air going into the top rad, because like I showed you in the video where we did the orientation of the fans, I switched everything back. So because now I've got this back into an exhaust, I want to get as much cool air in here to overcome the warm air that the bottom rad will be putting into the system, because the 5090, as you know, can create a stupid amount of heat when it comes to the water loops. So I also have a 140 fan to put in the back. It was delivered over the weekend and I forgot to bring it. But that's just more CFM of cool air also coming in. And if you recall, I have a theory that the cold air from here that's blowing down on the graphics cards, remember the air comes out at a cone shape, was actually helping lead to some of the lower GPU temps, because this backplate is actually touching the back of the GPU. And I do think that having this as an exhaust and all of these as intakes meant warm air from the rad here was hitting the GPU, potentially warming it up. So that's why that ended up having a slightly better temperature, but it wasn't great. So I think as long as I can get more fresh air to the top rad and then have that blowing directly on the GPU, especially with a 140 and more CFM, that's going to give me, I think, overall the best temperature for the system. Now there's one thing we have to fix here. If you look, my monitor is actually upside down when it comes to being a sensor panel. So what we're going to do now is we're going to come over here and we're going to right click. We're going to go display settings. We're going to go to our little display here, and then we need to rotate this. Orientation is portrait, and then portrait flipped. So as soon as I click portrait flipped, we should see that go the right way. And there we go. Now the last thing I don't want is I don't want the taskbar showing right there. So what we do is we go into taskbar settings in Windows, and then when using multiple displays, show taskbar in all displays. We want to check that one. Check. And now it's gone. So now it's set up as just being a sensor panel that is only using the iGPU built into my CPU, which is awesome because now those pixels aren't hitting the GPU at all. And the reason why I don't want that is because although this only may be like a 1280 pixel by, I don't remember, 100 and something wide pixels, even though it's not a lot and it's not gonna be doing any gaming or anything, just having multiple panels hooked up to your graphics card keeps the clocks up. By keeping the clocks up, we'll keep the temp up. By keeping the temp up means you're gonna keep the whole loop warmer than it actually needs to be. So having that on the CPU is actually pretty damn awesome because of the fact that now that's not just sitting there doing nothing. So that's pretty cool. I love the fact that we are now using the iGPU as our sensor panel. Anyway, when it comes to setting up the sensor panel, it can be pretty complicated, especially if you're using AIDA64. We have tutorials on that. In fact, it's been so long since I set one up, I'm gonna have to go back and watch our own tutorial so I know how to get the sensor panel up and running again. But the cool thing is, because of this graphics card, the 5090 Astral that's in here, doesn't just show the pin amperage in GPU Tweak, it shows it everywhere that you can see the sensor. So Hardware Info 64 sees the per pin voltage as well as the per pin amperage. So that's pretty awesome, because that means AIDA64 should be able to see it, and if it can see it, I can set an alarm on those so that if something were to happen where one of the cables or pins are starting to melt or get out of range, which would lead to melting, I can have AIDA64 actually pop up a window and alarm me saying, hey, this is out of range, whatever the range is that I set. I need to put a bit of a threshold in there too, though, because I do like to overclock, and I might decide to overclock, and if so, that will also pull more amperage. But anyway, it allows me to be able to set up an alarm so I can keep an eye on that. Whereas if you don't use something like a sensor panel and you don't use AIDA64 to do that, the only way that'll work with this GPU would be by leaving GPU Tweak open all the time, which I don't want to do. So anyway, there you go. Just kind of a quick video showing you the sensor panel install. Quite a few people actually recommended and requested that I show the installing of the sensor panel in here. That was a $100 panel, I think. Actually, I lied. It was only a $54 panel, and where I live, it's actually available same day, so that's pretty awesome. The stupid Corsair fan I bought was more expensive than the panel, but whatever. It is what it is. All right, guys, I'm gonna go ahead and get on out of here. Thanks for watching. I'll try to remember to put a link to that sensor panel down below. If not, if I forget, because I do all the time, that's the brand Wiseco or whatever it is, W-I-S-E-C-O-C-O. The quality looks good. The viewing angles are great from all angles, regardless which way you rotate it. So I do believe it to potentially be an IPS, like I thought it said. I could have swore it was an IPS panel. They're almost all IPS panels these days. It is a 1280 by 400. No, it just says LCD. Oh no, it is an IPS. It's an IPS 1280 by 400. It's only 60 Hertz though, but that doesn't matter. It's just a sensor panel. But all right, guys, thanks for watching. As always, we'll see you in the next one.